just a quick empirical question first. Why did the Australian government impose the exit clearance for citizens or residents are now in Australia, but they wish to leave? Why do they want to control leave?
I think I need to be a bit careful here in the sense that I haven't studied this per se in any detail, but my understanding is that it had to do with the return, actually. So in the sense that when someone leaves, in most cases that person will come back. And it connects to again one thing that the Australian government have done from the very beginning, and that was compulsory hotel quarantines for incoming travelers. So there's a very important logistical dimension about this, right? That people coming in, they need to be quarantined, and of course, when people then are departing, then that in most cases they will come back at one point. And my understanding of it is that has been quite strict, and generally speaking, what they have been much more liberal with has been people who are departing for a longer period of time. Nice. Because logistically speaking, it's easier to deal with, right? But someone who's planning to go away for a week, that is quite difficult to deal with. These policy positions, I believe, have changed a bit over time, and there are these efforts to try to liberalize this as well, and it connects to two other really interesting points, right? And one is a lot of the problems they had with the quarantines. So unfortunately, a lot of the hotel quarantines have also been keys to some of the spread of COVID, because the problem, of course, is that hotels are not designed. But they're not purpose-built to deal with the pandemic, right? So, for example, you can imagine air conditioning systems and things like that. One infected person might be in one room, and then because the aircon or ventilation systems are interconnected, you have actual spread of the air to all the rooms and things like this, right? So you had issues around that, and it's interesting that after 1.5 years of this, they still haven't gotten this right. But the other thing too, of course, again, is that Australia has a very large number of citizens stranded overseas who have not been able to come back. And this has to do with just the limited flights and the very, very sort of strict nature of the ability to return to Australia. So this idea of the exit permit, if you like, has to do with re-entry and the logistical issues around that.
Yeah, so that is, I guessed as well. And if that's true, I think it's a really interesting example that illustrates the 2 points you made. This logistical logic of mobility control is number one, is about the tracing. So it's not about anchoring people down, but it's tracing the flows, right? So that when you exit, they know that you may come back. So it's a whole process of mobility. Secondly, is anticipatory, right? It is it's not they don't want to prevent you from going away, but there's a question that they have to calculate and anticipate the next leg, right? The return. So you put it in a much nicer way than I did. This two logic of governance, the territorial versus the logistical. And the territorial, and it's especially interesting, you mention how the two intersect now, because somehow the lockdown, the using territorial logic, territorial again can be in turn divided into two methods. One is external, border closure, one is internal lockdown, right? That is also territorial because you stay where you are. It's often carried out at the state level, the provincial level. Then you, now the lockdown itself, as you said, one of the purpose of lockdown is to buy time to develop the infrastructure for the logistical, the logic of governance, the infrastructure for securitization of mobility. I think that is interesting because we know, I think government now learned that the territorial logic can never defeat the virus in itself, because the virus itself is mobile. no matter how strictly you close the border, the virus will sneak through. So therefore, it's inevitable. You have to develop this logistical method in order to securitize mobility. And of course, apart from the fact that the virus is so mobile and nimble, always find a way to sneak in, and the human being do need to resume their mobility in order for the society and the economy to be sustainable. And then I think you point out the effects, the very different effects of the two logics. If it's territorial, especially if you're thinking of the closure of external border, which is a kind of crude and a classical way of dealing with migration, then it is really a posit sovereignty towards the external society. And then the relation between citizens and their sovereignty is left in a kind of classical liberal mode, right? It's a minimum intervention and the citizens have a freedom inside, but outside the people cannot come in. I think the securitization and the logistical method of regulation really bring in the question about the internal constitution of citizenship and the sovereignty beyond the liberal principles, right? Now we have to talk about things like when you should put your face masks on and when you can take out such a very detailed bodily behavior regulation, right? So the relation between state and the citizen, the internal inside of sovereignty suddenly become much more complex than before. So the meaning of mobility immediately, becomes so much complicated and richer. So is the meaning of sovereignty, right? So especially in the liberal states, I think we somehow leave that part aside. And I think, as you mentioned, COVID is so fascinating because it really render all this, well, not render this visible, but also genuinely. Actually, it encouraged the creation or invention new ways of regulation, right? It's not something hidden and now become visible. Something was not there before. Genuinely, it's not there before.
Yes.
It's ontological. Yeah. So that's but also you mentioned, actually citizens are quite compliant, so that there are complaints actually about, the travel ban targeting India, but the internal law. Where received. I mean, all this kind of issue, I think is really interesting. Yeah.